Okay, so hopefully I'll take around an hour, hour and a half-ish. Stop me if I go too long. Pop questions in chat or save them up, and we can go through any questions at the end. Myself, my name's David. I'm General Secretary of the British Pteridological Society. Excuse me. And my aim really today is just to give you an introduction to ferns and lycophytes, which is quite a diverse group or range of plants. Explain a bit about them. If you want to contact me either with questions or ID queries, I'm more than happy to do that. There's my email address and my Twitter contact if you need that. As I say, I'll put all of this in an email for Richard to share later. In terms of what I want to cover, a bit about diversity of ferns and fern allies. The focus is going to be on British stroke Welsh species, but this applies to worldwide, quite a diverse range of plants. A little bit about the life cycle, because they help to define ferns and fern allies. Some explain about the different groups, cover some different habitats and species, and also go into a little bit about identification and how to tackle identification, which is in what is traditionally regarded as a difficult group to study. In reality, they're not too difficult, but they can get, they have got complex areas. I suppose the first thing really is to start off with what is a fern? What are we talking about? And ferns are defined as plants with vascular tissue. Okay, so unlike the bryophytes, the hornworts and the liverworts, they have the ability to move water around the structure of the plant using trachea. And that enables them to grow generally much larger than bryophytes, although there are some that sort of cross over and can be confused with bryophytes or liverworts. But in terms of reproduction, they have spores, okay? And I'll go into a bit more about the reproduction side and the spore-bearing structures. But the fact that they have spores is what separates them from gymnosperms, so things like the conifers, and angiosperms, the seed-bearing plants, the flowering plants. So they have quite a different life cycle, which obviously has implications both for identification and for cultivation. So if you're wanting to grow ferns, then they grow in a completely different way to traditional flowering plants. This fact that they reproduce by spores actually means they have two quite distinct halves to their life cycle. So it gives rise to something called alternating generations. And I'll show you some of those as well. Now this is quite a complex diagram. Don't worry too much about all of the details, but this is the most recent reclassification of fern phylogeny. And basically what it does is it breaks up the different ferns and lycophytes into families and puts them into some sort of taxonomic order in terms of the order in which they evolved. So right up at the top, we have the lycophytes, and these arrows indicate the ones which are representative in the British fern flora. So we have club mosses, quillworts and spike mosses, this top group. And then we have horsetails, which are familiar to a lot of people, adder's tongues, the ophioglossails, and then we have several representatives further down of what we tend to think of as the traditional fern. A lot of these other groups you don't find in a British fern flora. Some of these are tropical or neotropical species, but we do have a good representative number, a nice number to try and get your head around. The one thing about fern classification, all plant classification though, it is artificial. It is us trying to make sense of the botanical or the animal kingdom and put them into a structure that we can make sense of. The plants don't necessarily abide by the same rules. So sometimes there can be crossover and sometimes we move things, which can cause a bit of confusion. General overview of sort of the Pteridophyte flora of Europe. It's richest, we have about 192-ish species within Europe. Richest in Corsica and Macronesian Islands, also Pyrenees, Alps, Central Massif and the Carpathian Mountains. So upland areas tend to have a slightly more diverse fern flora because you've got a greater range of habitat niches principally. However, in the UK, Wales, Cumbria, Scotland and the west coast of Ireland again have a very good fern flora. Roughly 60, 65, 70 species, depending upon how you classify them and the time at which you classify them. We're not in complete agreement about all of the British fern flora. I'll come to that a bit later. But we do have, as I say, the west coast and up into Norway, where you've got the effects of the warm Atlantic current, meaning that the winter temperatures aren't too low, gives us a reasonable fern flora. So we tend to talk in pteridology about two main groups, and pteridology is not a proper taxonomic word, but basically it refers to both ferns and lycophytes and all the diversity that accompanies. Although in reality these two groups aren't overly closely related. We have the clubmosses, the quillworts and the spike mosses, and these are currently all grouped within the lycophytes. And then within the fern flora we have the horsetails, which might not appear to be obviously ferns, but they are, or the cisterclade. The ophioglossails, so things like the adder's tongues, moonworts, and then we have the more traditional fern-shaped ferns, for want of a better word. So as you can see, they're quite diverse in both structure and form, habitat, environments that they inhabit, so quite wide-ranging. But as I say, they all have in common the fact that they have vascular tissue and they have spore-bearing structures. And these spore-bearing structures are what are principally used to divide them up. I want to talk a little bit about fern reproduction, basically because, as I say, underpins most of how we classify ferns. And when we think of ferns, this is what we tend to think of. We tend to think of a sort of, we've got a couple of species here, but a shuttlecock-shaped structure out in a woodland somewhere. Here we've got a Dryopteris affinis, a nice big upright fern, and then around it we've got some Dryopteris dilatata in the foreground on the forest floor. And we tend to think of this as being a fern flora, but this is only one half of the life cycle. And very briefly, it consists of this is what we tend to think of, which is the top part, which is the fern with a root system, and that's what we tend to think of as the fern. On the back of each frond is a reproductive structure, and I'll go into those in more detail, but they then have a spore-bearing structure. Within that sporangium or spore-bearing structure, you have spores, and these are then released and drift off. They're carried by the wind and will land, hopefully, if they're lucky, on a suitable substrate. And they will then germinate into these little heart-shaped structures. These are then fertilized in water, and that gives rise to a new fern, the sporophyte. So this half is, the lower half is called the gametophyte stage, and the top half is really the sporophyte stage. So sporophytes are the things we tend to record, although not always. I'll show you some examples of the different stages. So if we look at the first thing usually any pteridologist does, and they meet a fern, is they usually turn it over. So gently turn the frond over, and on the back we're looking for these structures, the fertile part of the frond. And these are sori, and they have little paper covering over them, which we call an indusium. And the shape of the sori is pretty key to identification. So whether it's round, whether it's elongated, whether it's sort of kidney shaped or reniform, as in this case, whether it's circular, whether it has an indusium or whether it doesn't have an indusium, how that indusium behaves as the fern matures, are all key identification characteristics. So these are a young, immature indusia, sori, with indusia covering them. And then as they mature, the indusia will start to lift. Remember, I'm looking at the underside here. There's a bit of my thumb there for scale. And so underneath the indusia, you've got sporangia. And these are structures within which the spores are found. So those aren't the spores themselves, they're little spheres, sort of football-like structures that hold the spores inside them. And if I go in a little bit closer, so this is a different fern, this is a Polypodie, Polypodium. You can see these are the sporangia, so slightly buff-coloured football-shaped structures, and then these split open as they ripen, and you've got these tiny little, in this case, yellow spores that you can just make out sort of dotted over the frond and covering them. And these have, in some cases, in some genera, we actually have to use either the structure of the sporangia, so this little football-shaped structure, or we need to look at the spores to confirm identification. But a lot of species we can do without resorting to a microscope. If I've zoomed in a bit further here, and we've got three, it's not a brilliant photo, but we've got three pictures, three sporangia under the microscope, and a few spores dotted about. Now this is Polypodium cambricum, and the way we identify this species, there are three Polypodies in the UK, and what we do is if we look at the right hand structure, which is upside down as it happens, but we've got some basal cells at the top, and then this sort of spine that runs down, and these have bands, quite distinct bands on them, and we count the number of bands on 30 or 40 spores, spore-bearing structures, and see what the average is, and that will help us work out the species. And then we've got spores themselves, which in this case is quite simple. These aren't UK, these are Korean, but as you can see in some, certainly when you get to tropical and subtropical genera, you might need to be actually looking at spore surface ornamentation in order to work out species. So these ones can get quite involved. Fortunately, that's not the case for most UK species. I think there's only a couple where you need to look at the surface ornamentation. But these will help distribution. So they will catch the air currents, and the spores will drift off. They are actively catapulted out by the sporangia. The mechanism by which it opens will actually fire the spores out. But the spores are incredibly small, as you can see, sort of 30, 45 microns across. So they will drift in wind, and this aids long-range dispersal. So unlike something like a seed, which can only travel a short distance usually, or it might be aided by birds or insects, or mammals in terms of migration or movement of the seed, a lot of fern spores can travel incredible distances unaided. When it lands, it will grow into a new plant. And this is a gametophyte. So this is still a fern in its own right, and it can live quite happily in this stage, in some cases persistently, so they can live for many years. Not very frequently recorded, and I suppose you could quite easily be forgiven for mistaking this as a leafy liverwort or a small thallow's liverwort. They're 1 cell thick, incredibly small, you know, 0.5 millimeter. So you'll need a lens really to find these. But if you look on bare soil where it's damp or a damp wall, often you will find gametophytes. And sorry, if I could go back, on the underside of the gametophyte, we have male structures, Antheridia, and a female structure, Archegonia. And the male structures, which are usually at the back, the bottom here, you can see a few rhizoids, but under here there will be male reproductive structures. And when you get a drop of water lands on this, the sperm will swim out from underneath, and hopefully they'll find another gametophyte, sort of neighboring gametophyte, and they will swim through the water following a chemical gradient to the Archegonia, the female structure, swim up to the zygote, it, and complete the life cycle. Now, we don't know huge amounts about the gametophyte stage, but some of these stages can be very long-lived. Some ferns will suppress the growth of neighbours, so they will attract the sperm towards them, but suppress the release of the female cells on neighbouring plants. Some can self-fertilize. Obviously, if there are no neighbours about, then that's a useful aid to reproduction. Some require fungi to complete the task, so they obligate mycorrhizal associates. They live underground, and they don't have any photosynthetic tissue at all, and they rely on a fungus to provide the food for them. And they can live like that for 5 or 10 years. So they're quite diverse, the gametophyte stage. Once it's been fertilized, we have at the bottom here, you can just start to see the first frond of the new fern. So this is a diploid so the rest of the gametophyte is haploid, only has one set of chromosomes. The sporophyte is the fertilized part, and that has two sets. So that completes the life cycle as that grows into a new fern. Gametophytes aren't just sort of heart-shaped. They're this cordiform type on the left that we would find for most of the British ones. There are other shapes that you can find, so they're ribbon-shaped, filamentous and strap-shaped. Now the cordiform ones tend to be reasonably short-lived, so they will probably last for, in some cases, only a few days. In some cases, they might last for the summer, maybe until they dry out, until they're grazed by mollusks. Whereas the other forms, the ribbon-shaped and strap-shaped, the filamentous, tend to be much more long-lived. And some of them can live for hundreds of years, which has actually saved quite a lot of ferns, and I'll talk a bit about that later on. So this is an example of a filamentous one. This is probably our most famous in pteridological terms. This is the Killarney fern, Vandenboschia speciosa as it is now, which is a persistent gametophyte. So it can live quite happily and reproduce quite happily in this filamentous form. So it doesn't look like a fern at all. And it can live in very dark conditions with very low light levels, lower light than most vascular plants can cope with. And that has actually saved it, because this was collected pretty much to extinction during the Victorian era, but the gametophytes have persisted, and now they're starting to throw out new sporophytes, so new adult plants, if you like. There are about 25 species worldwide that we know of that spend their life purely in a gametophyte stage and don't seem to exist in a sporophyte stage. This is another one, a common fern in the aquarium trade, Lemuriopsis. This is growing in a little sort of kiln jar of water, and it spends its life in a, it's not a British one, I hasten to add, spends its life in this sort of strap-shaped habit. In the tropics, it would grow in flooded forests, where it would spend its gametophyte stage like this, and then the sporophyte stage would actually grow up into the trees, so it would literally climb up into the canopy by the use of rhizomes that would move up a trunk and then up into the branches. But this one just persistently lives in its gametophyte stage. So as I say, gametophyte is half of the life cycle, but very rarely recorded. So if you want a real challenge, try recording gametophytes. And then you get the immature fern. So this is, in actual fact, this picture. We've got a young sporophyte, which is the main part. And then just to the left, don't know if you can see, there's a gametophyte with a young sporophyte growing. Then bottom left corner, you've got a gametophyte on its own. On the left-hand side, there's another gametophyte. There's a few mosses as well within there. This is actually in a expired root of a tree fern, and tree ferns are brilliant for growing ferns in the same way as they're used for growing orchids. A lot of the time they're harvested for growing ferns in, which has had a big effect on tree ferns in the wild. So if you do happen to have a tree fern and it has died, don't throw it out, just keep watering it, keep watering it, keep watering it, and you never know what will grow in the tree fern. So that's a little bit about the life cycle. I want to cover So I'll go into the 6 main groups. I'm not going to cover every species, otherwise we'll be here all day, which I'm happy to do, but you'll probably want some lunch at some point. Club mosses. In Wales, we have 4 species, Diphasiastrum, Hubertia, Lycopodiella and Lycopodium, so 4 different genus. We have one that's gone extinct in Wales, interrupted club moss, Spinula manatinum, and then a couple that are only found in England or Scotland. So this will start with my favourite club moss, Lycopodiella inundata, endangered in Wales, 6 sites throughout Wales, and I'm fortunate that I have visited all of them. This is the subject of my master's study. An intriguing little plant that doesn't like competition, but does like wet feet. So typically grown in upland bogs and has this creeping rhizome that work through waterways and peat bogs, and then it gives rise to these vertical structures, and these are actually cones, or the proper name is strobili, and these contain the spore-bearing structures. So when these are fertile, these will release the spores. If I show you the next one, so those are more mature. It's on a different club moss, Lycopodium clavatum or stag's horn club moss. So this is a sort of mountain species. The strobili here stand on these long stems, and then when they mature, these will open up and release this yellow powder, the Lycopodium powder. Used to be used in photography, so for creating flash. It's also used for special effects, still used in special effects for creating bright flashes and flames without heat. It used to be used in the pharmaceutical industry for coating tablets and condoms, because the powder is waterproof. Basically, the spores are incredibly oil rich, so they burn with this very intense flash, and they're still harvested in some areas, fortunately not here. They have these distinctive white hairs on the tips of the leaves, the microphyls, which gives it this slightly glossy white appearance. Another club moss, this is Hubertia, quite common one. If you go walking in the mountains, you should hopefully come across this, usually in fairly dry areas. Don't forget, ferns only actually need water for the sexual stage, so for the gametophyte to, for the antheridia to send the sperm to the archegonia. So they only actually need water at that stage. After that, they can live quite independently of water. So things like Hubertia, you'll often find growing in really dry crevices and cracks and scree and sheltered overhangs, where it doesn't look like it will get any water. It will do. And you can see on this one the spore-bearing structures, these yellow sporangia between the microphyls, the leaves. For those of you who are familiar with Hubertia, it's a hexaploid, so it has 6 sets of chromosomes. I've not talked about chromosomes, but ferns have this amazing ability not just to have 2 sets of chromosomes, but they can have 3, 4, 6, 8. They can double them, and that gives them special abilities, if you like. We have just found the diploid Hubertia in the UK, which we suggest may be American species, Hubertia oppressa. So this may be changing in terms of from Hubertia, but I don't think so. Another club moss, this one's extinct in Wales. You can see it in Scotland. The interrupted club moss. This is actually found this in Treborth Herbarium when they were in their sort of digitizing phase. When it used to be on top of the gliders, Neacum Llynicwn on the gliders, up until the 1840s, when it was collected and unfortunately collected to extinction, as with a lot of ferns. We have another group of lycophytes, which are the quillworts, and in Wales we only have two species, Isoetes lacustris and Isoetes echinospora. There is a third one which you can find in Cornwall, which is the land quillwort. And thanks to Tristan, who came on the last fern course that I did, and he sent me this picture and said I could use it, which was lovely of him. And this is an Isoetes lawn in a Welsh lake. And as you can see, it's an aquatic fern, so it spends its whole life underwater, including all the reproductive phase, although we don't know much about it, to be honest. More typically, this is how you would see Isoetes washed up on the shore of a lake, as in the top left picture. So in winter, after a good storm, go and have a look at a lake shore, and it's a great way of looking at aquatic flora. So in this case, we've got some quillworts, a water lobelia as well as being washed up. And then if you peel off these quills, so each one of these long leaves, at the base of some of them, you've got the bottom left, you've got these spores. So these are female spores. So most spores are they don't have a gender. However, in quillworts and spike mosses, they do. So we have very big female spores. So there's 3 in that picture in the center. And we actually use, this is one of the species where we use the surface ornamentation of the spores to identify the species. So you do have to stick this one under a microscope to ID it. Otherwise, all quillworts tend to look the same. They will look this sort of elongate structure. Top right shows a picture of one in situ in Cornwall, and also sort of illustrates part of the problem that quillworts are suffering, which is increased nutrient levels in water bodies. So quillworts need oligotrophic water, so that's water with very low nutrient levels, very clear water, low pollution, don't tolerate pollution at all. And the moment there's any increase in nitrification or phosphates, you tend to get algal blooms, and that clouds the water and stops the growth of this aquatic flora. Bottom right are the male microspores. So it took me a while to find those, but they're much smaller than the female megaspores. Spike mosses. This is, again, these are heterosporous, so they have 2 types of spores, a large female megaspore and a small male microspore. We have 1 native and 1 introduced species in Wales and the UK. Very small representation, because this is the largest genera of lycophytes worldwide, 700 species worldwide. You do find them in the horticulture trade as well, so it's far starting to become popular in garden centres. This is the first one. This is our native tiny little Clubmoss. You can just see it in front of my size 9 boot there. I don't know if you can just make out, there are actually 3 tiny little spikes. There's a close-up. So diminutive little plant, and 2 centimeters, 3 centimeters high, with these large megaspores, or megasporangia at the top, and then microsporangia underneath. So this is something that you'll find, again, if you're lucky, in the mountains, or maybe in sand dunes, in slacks or damp sand dunes. You might find these. They're usually a sign of base enrichment. So there's a little bit of improvement to the generally acidic conditions that you'd find in the mountains. And often, if you're finding Selaginella, you'd be starting to look for some of the more interesting alpine upland plants as well. This is one a little bit later in the season. So this one, the spores pretty much ripe, I should imagine. The plant's still green. So you've got the main body of the plant, and then this is the spore-bearing structure above, the cone. But they're not that well differentiated between the two different types. But as you see, it is a tiny little plant, so not easy to find. And then that's much later in the season, into autumn. The spores have been released, and the plant can often turn this sort of pleasing yellow colour, which does make it slightly easier to find. This is our other introduced species, which is Selaginella kraussiana. Kraus is club moss from South Africa, but often found in greenhouses. This is actually in Treborth, and then from there tends to escape into the wider environment. Fortunately, it doesn't cause any great issues. It's usually killed by frost, so it's happy in a greenhouse, but often not happy outside of a greenhouse. Then, so we've done the 3 groups of lycophytes. So what I want to do is quick look at the 3 groups of ferns. And the first one isn't really the sort of obvious fern. This is actually a sister clade to ferns. Originated at about, or before the main body of ferns, but after the lycophytes. Reached its peak really in the Silurian. So I think that's about 420 million years before present. And we have a good range within the UK, 25 species worldwide, but most people only know the one, which is the field horsetail, Equisetum arvense, which is, if you like, the problem horsetail. The rest of them are not really problems. So this is start with a fossil one really, as it's a Welsh one as well. This is from Brimbo Fossil Forest near Wrexham, and the coal measures there, and most coal measures were primarily composed of these fossil horsetail, fossil tree ferns. So this is a calamites, they're often called, but you can see a very strong resemblance to the modern horsetail, except they're much larger. These are 2 examples of modern horsetails, current ones, and they also illustrate an important distinction between some of the horsetails. On the left, we've got field horsetail, Equisetum arvense, and this is, if you like, the problematic one that you've got in your garden and you can't get rid of, or on the allotment. And then on the right, we've got marsh horsetail, Equisetum palustri. And what we're looking at is the cone, or the spore-bearing structure, and this time they're on the top of the plant. And in one group, they're on vegetative structures that have no chlorophyll. So these appear before the rest of the plant and cast the spores. And another group, they occur on the top of the green plant. Okay, now on the one on the left, you can actually just see some of the more traditional green structures plant behind. And on the right, all of the tops of the stems have these cones or strobe-like. And that really is used to divide the ecosystem's. Now, I'm not going to go into identification of ecosystem's because it is quite specialist, but basically what you're looking at is a cross-section of the stem, and you're looking at the arrangement of the structures inside the stem, but also branching. All the ones on the right have the vegetative cone, so subgenus Equisetum, and they can all hybridize with each other, which makes life really interesting. Whereas the ones on the left, Variegatum, Hyomale and Ramiosum, again, they can hybridize with each other, but their cones are usually on the top of the green plant. Now, we're getting into the point at which actually you can often find horsetail cones coming up. And if you have a microscope, I would suggest grabbing a cone, just leave it to dry and the spores will come out. And the spores have these two basically long, very long strap-like structures on them called elaters. And these curl in dry weather, they expand, and then when they find damp conditions, they contract. And they will do that repeatedly. If you breathe on them under the microscope, you will see them expand and contract. And they almost walk across the microscope slide. Fascinating to watch, and kids absolutely love looking at them under the microscope. But that ability enables the spores to find damp ground. And as anybody knows, or grows or knows horsetails, will know that they like water. So they like heavy soils, they like clays, they like boulder clays, they like ponds and ditches, marshes, sand dune slacks, anywhere where there's a little bit of moisture year round in the ground, and that's really the horsetail habitat. Including ones that have become totally aquatic, so Equisetum fluviatile. Again, this is up in Cwmydwall. It's been missing for the last couple of years. I didn't get to look for it last year, obviously due to lockdown, but the last couple of years I've not been able to find it, and I think again that might be due to increased pollution. You can see there's quite a bit of algal growth on the bottom of that photo, and that may be affecting its reproduction. It can grow vegetatively, so it will creep through the lake bed, but I'm not sure that the gametophyte stage is able to cope with the algal increase. I think it makes a lovely front lawn, although probably not many people would agree with me. So that's your more typical Equisetum problem, if you like. They rely really on disturbance. The more you try and pull them up, the more of a problem you're going to have. And the same goes. I'm an allotment grower, and it's a pain on my allotment. The more you try and dig it, the more you roots into little fragments, and they can reproduce in the root. Equisetum arvense also has 3 different growth forms, which just aid confusion when you're trying to identify it. So you have this upright growth form at the back, this sort of splayed, almost horizontal growth form, which looks like it's just bending over and then growing up again. And I should have cleared this front piece out of the way, but there's one in the very foreground, which is almost like a grass structure, star-shaped. So Equisetum arvense is very adaptable, very tough plant. It's been around for, as I say, 400 million years. It's learned to adapt. Another one, Dutch rush. So this one doesn't tend to have branches, or not many branches. Often used to be called as scouring rush, although it's not a rush at all. It is a horsetail, because they have very, very high silica content. They extract silica from the surrounding soils, and they use that as a defense against herbivores. And they used to be used before the advent of the scouring pad. This was the original pot scouring pad, a handful of Dutch rush. It is native, but was imported in such large quantities from Holland to London and the southeast that it was given the name Dutch rush. But as I say, it is native. Can be a bit of a pain if it escapes, and you will find this in the sort of garden pond trade. Right, three very distinct ferns: Patricium and two Ophioglossums, and these are magical ferns. If anybody has seen these, you will get a squeal of excitement when you find these. This is Moonwort, Patricium lunaria, and a small plant of unimproved grasslands, really. So whether that's a meadow up in the mountains where there hasn't been any form of soil improvement, again, places like Aberfrown, the dunes there, you could find this. Quite distinctive shape. The front part is the spore-bearing structure, and then the back part is the frond. But actually, it's just one stem, so it's rather a confusing structure to look at. This is a nice large one. Just be warned, they can be a quarter of that size. And certainly if you find them in Newborough, they are a quarter of that size. Certainly if you do find these, please always record these locations and send them to Govnod. Probably was once a lot more common than it is now. They have suffered with land improvement. We think they are mycorrhizal obligates in the same way as things like wax caps. So they rely on a fungal partner, and anything that changes the soil structure to favour usually the vascular plants, so adding nitrogen or adding manure, will usually impede the fungi, and that often has effect by reducing the moonworts. Moonworts, just as a sideline, the shape of them, if you use your imagination, you can see a key, and often it was used in sort of spells or potions because of its ability to open locks, apparently. This is another one that has a lot of sort of history around it, but becoming less common. Again, please record these. Very easy to overlook, these two. Ophioglossum vulgatum, so common adder's tongue on the left, and small adder's tongue on the right. Now the one on the left, I would say, is probably about the size. That one's a little bit smaller than the palm of your hand, whereas the one on the right is probably about thumbnail sized, with a little lily beetle. Again, unimproved meadows, grasslands, they need good light, but they're very easy to overlook, and they don't like any form of nitrogen. So again, we've got the spore-bearing structure in the middle, and then the blade. In this case, we tend to call it a blade rather than a frond, but it is a frond. and you can just make out the lines on it. These are immature, and when they're mature, the spores will come out from between those lines. And you actually count the number of lines to help identify the species, but size is also important. The one on the right, Ophioglossum azoricum, has the largest number of chromosomes of any plant, so 1,260 pairs, so quite a phenomenal number of chromosomes, and that's probably a result of historic doubling. So as I say, ferns are very good at doubling their chromosomes occasionally, and it's got a massive number. Then we come on to, if you like, the more traditional, what we tend to think of as ferns. Now, bear in mind those numbers on the right are UK numbers. We don't have all of these in Wales. Just having a look down, things like the Jersey fern, we don't have. Lady ferns, we have one rather than three. But that's probably a fairly good list of the fern flora. So Bracken, we only have one in Wales, as we have two in Scotland. So these are what most people think of as ferns. So I'll sort of run through the major groups of them. Start with the most prestigious, I suppose. The royal fern, Osmunda regalis, a lovely, huge fern, can become really big, can become our largest fern at sort of 3 meters. Although very rarely will you find decent sized ones. If you're in North Wales and you visit the FSC Centre at Rhydycriau, they've got some really nice large examples in the back of the building there. It likes water. This is a waterside plant. Typically nowadays you'll only find it growing in sort of bogs in the mountains or where it hasn't been collected. Sometimes in the Celtic rainforests you can find good numbers of them on cliffs and next to rivers. It has green photosynthetic spores. So on the left there's a picture of a young, the spore bearing structures are on the top of the main frond, so it's quite unusual in that respect. This is one of the first fern lineages to have evolved, and it hasn't actually changed for certainly 200 million years plus. You can find fossil ones that are identical. But it's unusual in terms that the spores, which are green and photosynthetic, and they have to pretty much land on mud and grow into the gametophyte straight away. They can't be stored. A lot of fern spores can be stored and then sown later, but Osmunda can't. We go from the very large to the very small. I'll come back to Osmunda a bit later. This is one of the hymenophyllums, and the Hymenophyllaceae, the filmy ferns, we have 3 species in the UK. Really, they're a tropical genus of ferns. You have a lot of them in the tropics, I think 350 species-ish, but as I say, only 3 in the UK. These you might mistake for maybe a leafy liverwort. They're very small, diminutive. Usually they're 1 cell thick, so they don't have stomata. They do still have the ability to remove water, but they don't have stomata, so they don't have the ability to control their loss of water. So they like really damp, humid environments. So this is a Celtic rainforest specialist, or under wet scree, you might find these in sheltered combes where they're not going to dry out too much. Again, here you've got good liverwort flora with them. And that's obviously a good indication. If you've got good bryophyte and liverwort flora, then you're in filmy fern habitat. So always a nice one to find, Hymenophyllum tumbrigensiae. This is its other one, other common filmy fern, which is Wilson's, Hymenophyllum wilsonii. You can see distribution-wise, it's very much Cornwall, Wales, Scotland, Ireland. And really, if you sort of map that against rainfall, you can see that there's a very good correspondence with rainfall. You need huge amounts of water for filmy ferns. The actual spore-bearing structure for filmy ferns isn't on the underside. It's this sort of helmet-shaped structure. And you can just make out the sporangia inside, and then within those sporangia are the spores. These ones, Wilson's filmy fern, the sporangia doesn't have teeth. That's how we identify it. There are also differences in the cell structure. If you look at the chloroplasts in the cells, they're laid out in a different way. Tunbridge filmy fern, the other one, has teeth, quite distinct teeth on the edge of the sporangia. Sorry, on the end of the sori. But as you can see, they're very thin. They're about 3 or 4 cells thick, where you've got the vascular tissue, but otherwise they're very small, delicate plants. And this is the last filmy fern, the Killarney fern. So this is the same one as we saw earlier, the fuzzy felt filamentous gametophyte. You can see it in the background here. And this is the sporophyte, which is very rare. Highly protected, and this sort of illustrates one of the real problems that occurred during the Victorian era, but even up to the modern day. These were collected, these were highly prized for growing in terraria at home by the Victorian gentleman or lady. This would be the perfect thing to have at home. And these were collected to extinction. Luckily, the gametophyte persisted, and we're starting to get a few of these gametophytes, a few of these sporophytes, or these beautiful filmy ferns are starting to reappear. You find them in very dark places. Usually you'll end up with a head wound by crawling around in caves and things, trying to find these. These make use of the infrared light spectrum, and they would never normally see sunlight in their lifetimes. Very long-lived, but very slow-growing. We go from the sort of rare to the very common. This is probably something that most people have seen in passing. Usually on walls rather than in trees. This is Polypodium vulgare, and this is a fern that we tend to think of fern lineages as being very old, but the Polypodium and Polypodie group are actually quite recent, recent in terms of evolution. So these really have made use of the arboreal habitat. So once you get flowering plants creating forests, you've got a whole new ecological niche. It's very specialist. You've got high exposure to light, you've got no soil, you've got sort of very drying winds, quite a tough habitat to live in. But Polypodium has adapted to that with this creeping rhizome that creeps along tree branches. And humans have helped. We've sort of made walls, and often you'll find Polypodium quite happily growing along the top of a wall. So this is something that has adapted to the urban environment. There we are, there's an example. This is on Menai Bridge. That's actually on the Anglesey side. the Innersmon side. So if you have a look at where these big chains sink into the ground on the Innersmon side, you can find these Polypodiums growing quite happily. They only need somewhere for the gametophyte to grow and reproduce, and then the sporophyte can grow with incredibly small amount of soil, or no soil really. It just needs moisture for the fertilization stage. Then after that, it's quite happy. We go to, this is another one that is really only needs water in the fertilization stage, and then after that it likes humidity, but it's also quite happy in very dry scree. And this is a proper mountain fern. So this is the parsley fern because of the way it looks, Cryptogramma crispa. And this it's what we call dimorphic fronds, so two very distinct shapes of fronds. We have at the bottom here, we have the sterile vegetative fronds. So these are present through the majority of the growing season. And then later in the season, we'll get these distinctly upright, vertical, fertile fronds. And these carry the spore-bearing structures. That's quite a common reproductive strategy in a lot of ferns. So you have your main fronds, and then you hold up your spores later in the season for catching the wind and sort of increased spread, if you like. But a beautiful fern, bright green, find it in the mountains. Then we go to a very small diminutive fern, often actually found in very dry conditions, so under rocks. We tend to think of ferns as sort of liking really damp habitats, but these actually like very free draining conditions, under a boulder, tucked away, tiny little fern, oak fern, Gymnocarpium. And then a large genus, well, the largest genus of ferns worldwide, and also in the UK really, well, sorry, not in the UK, but certainly worldwide, Asplenium. And there are 700 plus species worldwide. We have, I think, about 9 in the UK. They do like to hybridize, so Aspleniums are quite happy forming hybrids with other Aspleniums. But this is a beautiful one that you should be able to find at this time of year. Tavor de Heath, Hart's Tongue Fern, lovely little entire frond, so it's not divided in any way. And this quite distinctive uncurling, which is called, its proper name is circinate venation. But basically we call it a crosier, and the way in which it unravels. There are very few plants that unravel in that manner, other than things like Drosera. They will unravel in the same way, and a few other groups, but generally it's restricted to the ferns. Aspleniums have quite adaptable, and they've adapted well to the urban environment. So you should have an Asplenium somewhere near you. As I say, Hart's Tongue Fern, very common urban fern. Probably the most common urban fern is wall rue, Asplenium rutimeraria. Tiny little fern you find growing on bridges, sheltered walls, anywhere where there's a little bit of base enrichment, so lime mortar that's decayed, that sort of thing. They'll be quite happy. Another one, this is rustyback, Asplenium cataract. So again, in this showing its typical habitat. It's actually quite difficult to find it in the wild, certainly in the UK, outside of an urban environment or a man-made structure. So walls are ideal places for looking for Asplenium cataract. And here the sori actually merged together on the back to give it a completely rusty coloured underside, hence its name, rusty back fern. And as I say, so two more Asplenium, very common, Asplenium trichomanes, urban fern, and another hart's tongue there. They need moisture for the reproduction, and after that, they don't really need much, and they so can adapt to quite diverse environments. So a proper lockdown fern for you to go and find. These are outside drains, brilliant for finding Aspleniums. We go from the very common to the incredibly rare. I think we've got 9 of these in Wales, 9 plants. Alpine woodsia, again, these were collected to extinction. They're suffering with climate change. They're slow growing, so everything is sort of stacked against them. This is actually a fully adult fertile plant. So as you can see, for scale, you know, usually you'd need a lens to find it or look at some of the structures. You won't stumble across these, and no one's going to tell you where they are, and we'd never suggest handling these. These are very delicate plants, and as I say, fully protected under the UK law, Schedule 8 species. This is one that you will find where you've got water. This is the lady fern, Redonanthia. So Ethereum felix femina. Now, this is a very graceful fern. She always likes to have wet feet. So often if you see it growing in a field, it's a good indication that there's an underwater stream or a drain underneath. Here, growing along the banks of a little river. Now, the fact that it's called lady fern, it has nothing to do with its gender. The Victorians were completely confused as to how ferns reproduced. Because they don't have flowers, it was a bit of a mystery. So they used to be called cryptogams, hidden, basically means hidden gametophyte stage or hidden sex stage. And they didn't know how they reproduced. And they thought that these, which are nice, delicate, graceful fronds, must be lady ferns. And the more robust, upright ones were the male ferns, which are the Dryopteris family. And I thought it must be something to do with that. But as I say, completely wrong. Very beautiful fern. About 10% of these will have purple stems. So if you find lady ferns, have a look through, and often you'll find a purple stemmed variety as well. These have J-shaped indusium on the back of the frond. A little fern of damp woodlands and uplands, again, likes shelter under rocks. Phegopteris conicalis fern, very pretty bright green fern with these backward facing pinnules at the base. And this is a sort of typical plant in a nice sheltered woodland habitat. Each frond, I would say, is probably a little bit bigger than the palm of my hand. Whereas that is also a fully fertile adult frond, but in the mountains. So just a tiny bit bigger than my thumbnail. Okay, so they can be, if they're in exposed conditions, and that's something that can catch people out. You know, you have to be mindful of where they're growing as to how it affects their growth structure. Another common fern in Wales, this likes acid habitats, so conifer woods, moorland habitats. Again, it likes a bit of moisture. This is the hard fern, Struthiopteris. It used to be called Blechnum. Most people probably still know it under its old name of Blechnum spicant, but a few years ago it was moved to Struthiopteris spicant. A tough fern, Again, with dimorphic fronds, so this hasn't got it on this plant, but later in the season it will have strong, upright, vertical pointing, fertile fronds, often described as like a fish skeleton. So these look like a sort of fish with flesh on, but then the upright, fertile fronds look very, very thin. And then we have 3 Polystichums within the UK, like base enrichment. So these are really sort of ferns of limestone habitats, which we don't have huge amounts within Wales, but there are some nice areas of limestone. So this is the hard shield fern, Polystichum aculeatum, and the soft shield fern is Polystichum sativum. Very easy to confuse with each other, especially early in the season when they both tend to be soft. Later in the season, this will become, you can see the older fronds behind, they're quite persistent and they become quite tough and leathery. But it's actually the shape of these pinnules that we use to identify them. This is a much rarer one. This is one that's found in a couple of locations in Snowdonia. You're unlikely to stumble across this. You're looking for it. Again, protected. And this is Polystichum longitis. So you can see how it does have a similarity to the previous one, and often confused with them. Young Polystichum aculeatums are often recorded as holly ferns, but there are some distinct differences. And then we move on to the largest, probably the most confusing group within the British ferns, which is the Dryopteris. This is Dryopteris affinis stricto, so this is the golden scale male fern. Nice distinct upright habitat, lemon green early in the season, winter green, so these are quite persistent into the winter until they're usually collapsed by snow. We've actually got a few bracken fronds around as well. The Dryopteris group includes the male fern, the scaly male fern aggregate, and the buckler ferns. So it's quite a large group and often presents the most problems for people recording ferns. We also have a very rare buckler fern in Wales. So this is above Llangollen on the limestone there. This is the rigid buckler fern, Dryopteris submontana, and it's basically only found there and in the Brecon Beacons in Wales, and it has these distinct, as with most ferns that occur on limestone habitats, have these distinct glands. So there's glandular look under a hand lens. Also quite characteristic, has very blue-green, mealy look to it. Very persistent fronds, but lives in a very exposed, difficult conditions. And needless to say, during the Victorian era was collected to extinction again, but there are a few specimens in North Wales, which I'm currently mapping those. Then we have a very common Dryopteris, Dryopteris dilatata. This is the broad buckler fern. Buckler ferns are tripinnate, so I haven't gone into pinnateness. I didn't want to confuse people too much, but basically with fern identification, we count the number of divisions in the fern, and this is often regarded as a tripinnate fern, but it's quite a triangular shape overall. And the key characteristic with these are the scales that occur on the bottom part of the stem, or the stipe, and they have very particular, so there are 4 Dryopteris buckler ferns, and by looking at those scales you can work out which of those it is. So this is a very similar one but slightly different look to it. So this is Dioptrus amula. This is much rarer. Dioptrus dilatata you'll find in most woodlands. Dioptrus amula you will only really find in Atlantic coastal woodlands. So down around Banff-Fistiniog is a good place to find these. You need a lot more humidity, much more graceful, delicate frond with these slightly upturned pinnacles, quite subtle characteristic, but easy to see in the field in a photo. Ferns have a long history before people came around, but obviously once people came around, that impacted on their history as well. So just a brief sort of bit about ferns and people before I dive into identification. Let me just grab a drink. This was a comment by Nona Valeris, who, this is so mid-Victorian times, and she was a botanical travel writer, I suppose, and she made a very astute comment. The poor ferns, like the wolves in the olden time, have a price set upon their heads, and they, in like manner, will soon altogether disappear. We must have fern laws and preserve them like game. And it was very astute because the Victorian era saw what became known as pteridomania, which was the fern craze. And this is when ferns were seen as status symbols. So suddenly they were prized by initially the wealthy, who would want them as a status symbol. They would be able to grow them. This is just after the glass tax had been repealed. So people were able to have glass houses, or if you're rich, a fernery. You had the Wardian case had just been developed, so you could keep plants safe from the dirty London smog. And suddenly everybody wanted a fern in their living room. They're quite happy in sort of low light conditions in a glass case. So people went out, again, with the advent of the railways, travel was extended, and you could go and collect your ferns. Because of the sort of hidden side of the reproduction, we didn't know how ferns reproduced. So it was considered safe for the Victorian lady to be involved in. There's no gratuitous sex involved. A lady could quite safely go out and collect ferns and not be exposed to a more lurid side. So obviously it became the perfect vocation for ladies, and subsequently men decided to go and collect ferns as well. Now, initially it was the common ferns that were collected. So these are sort of Polypodies on the right, Polypodium vulgare or interjectum, or cambricum. And initially the common ferns were collected, and then people wanted more unusual ferns. So they wanted different types, or sports. So where this one in the middle's got sort of bifurcating fronds, which is quite unusual in the Polypodies, and that would have been highly collectible. You've also got fern guides starting to appear, so new publications with different methods of colour printing that enable field guides to be evolving, and again an increase in the interest in ferns. And it was an interest that was marketed as only for intelligent people. So hence everybody wanted to be involved. And people went out collecting, and then a trade built up around the collection of ferns. And there's a lovely picture there by Charles Lidderdale. Ferns have appeared in everything, cutlery, china, glassware, fabrics, even on the custard cream. So the next time you have your custard cream, look closely and you will see croziers, little fern fronds on the front of the custard cream. Now, unfortunately, that led to mass collecting, and this was one of the ferns that really suffered, was the royal fern. That little picture of North Wales in the top left, everywhere east of that or right of that line, the royal fern was collected to extinction, and not found commonly that side of the line now anyway. It still existed quite well in the mountains and on the Fleen and the more remote areas. But you could buy a royal fern at every train station in North Wales. So much the same as today, you might pop to a train station and buy a cactus, I don't know, then you could buy a fern. Unfortunately, it then had a double whammy, because when the orchid trade came along later, royal ferns were regarded as perfect growing medium for orchids. So they were then these big, very rare fern stumps were sort of cut up and sold for the orchid trade. And that still goes on in other countries. Very rarely we will find a fern this size. If we get to the other end of the spectrum, when most people think of ferns, this is the fern that they think of. Obviously in Wales, give rise to freeth, the upland habitat or borderline habitat above the woodland, which is bracken habitat. Bracken is actually a woodland fern. It has adapted quite well to being without trees. Normally you would find it in woodland, sheltered woodland, and it will be spotted about here and there in the occasional glade. However, when you chop down the forest, it becomes the primary cover. There's nothing to inhibit it. Its rhizome goes down 6 feet or more, certainly to the bedrock if it can. And it has sort of 2 sets of underground buds, so that if you cut one off, it will reappear very quickly. And hence it's become our most widespread fern in Britain and in the world generally. Can become a real problem where it's been introduced. Frost tender, so it occurs sort of not in the mountains themselves, but certainly lower down. And obviously, being a tropical fern, it tends to turn this beautiful autumn colours once the frosts start to arrive. Unusual in that it's the only fern with nectaries. If you actually look at the base, if you turn over a young bracken frond, where the lowest set of branches split off, you'll find, it's not very well shown, but 2 sets of nectaries, and these occur all the way up the stem. And these exude nectar for ants, and the ants will then defend the bracken against herbivores, so typically insects. Bracken is, I suppose, a good example of ongoing evolution. It's one of those plants that is in a continual battle with insect predators. So it's evolved quite an impressive array of chemical defenses. This one is thiaminase, this little protein on the left, and that basically damages vitamin B within animals, ruminants. So it causes bright eye in sheep and cattle, blindness in horses, which is why it's not loved by graziers. It's also got a whole raft of chemicals that it can use against insect predators. Most of the time it relies on vegetative propagation, so it creeps through the surrounding soils. It can spore, but we're right really at the northern edge of its distribution. So it's very rare to find it sporing. This is actually, you can see where it has been fertile. Most of the time you just get this, what's called a false inducia, around the edge of the pinnules. But once every 7 years or so, you'll get a good hot year. Then you'll get a good amount of spore production. And these produce billions and billions of spores, so you don't need many to successfully germinate to set off a new generation. But most bracken is clonal in terms of its spread. It is an important habitat in its own right. It's obviously replaced tree cover, where the trees have been removed, eventually trees would colonize and it would become woodland again or forest again, but usually that's been prevented by grazing. Often mistakenly it's burnt, which does nothing but help the bracken, because it's perfectly adapted to fire, and is the first thing to regenerate after fire, and that actually helps it spread quite well. The ash is very rich in I think it's potassium, so it was used in the glass making industry historically. It does support a wide range of invertebrates, about 40, I think there are 9 moths and 40 other invertebrates, sawflies and gall wasps and things that will quite happily survive feeding on bracken or using bracken as the primary cover, and an astonishing number of fungal associates. So that's bracken map fungus, which you'll always find on bracken stems late in the autumn, but rarely recorded. I'm not prone to giving overt publicity, but I'm quite happy to publicise this company. This is Dalefoot Composts in the Lake District, and they have started harvesting bracken. It is a problem in uplands for graziers, but typically it used to be sprayed with Azulox for bracken control, which unfortunately is indiscriminate and kills all ferns, regardless of whether it's bracken or some of the rarer ferns, and was a bit of a problem with spray drift, and also terrible for watercourses. Now Dalefoot have started taking 2 basically low value products, wool from the shearing industry and bracken, and started making compost. I've got a feeling there's a grower on Anglesey who started as well, and hopefully it's something we'll start to see more of, because these composts are a perfect replacement for peat. The horticultural industry and its use of peat is a really big problem. So anything that helps reduce that or remove that altogether is great in my book. So yeah, the Dalefoot peat-free composts, and I think they've now taken up by the RHS, so they've pledged to go peat-free as well. So anybody who's a grower, please go peat-free. This is another example of sort of ferns and man, or in particular ferns and sheep, to neighbouring. The one on the left is a small island, and the one on the right is the more traditional Welsh upland view of sheep grazed uplands with a few rushes. But on the left you've got probably a mixture of Dryopteris, Ethereums, maybe some Oreopteris, male mountain ferns, nice bluebells as well. So it shows the difference that excluding grazing can make. Obviously, traditionally this would then gradually evolve into a woodland, so you get rowan and birch coming in, and then finally oak woods. We have, as humans, moved ferns. Bracken is one example. It's a real problem in New Zealand. This is another one that we've moved around. This is water fern, which is Azolla folliculoides. You can find this in watercourses in Wales and throughout the UK. Luckily, it is now treatable. Tiny little aquatic fern, just to show you, tends to sort of float on the water surface, and then you get these roots hanging down into the water. And it actually, the red dots on this are cyanobacteria, and it has a symbiotic relationship with the cyanobacteria. The cyanobacteria fix nitrogen, so they can basically increase the nitrogen available for the fern, and that means it can have really explosive growth. It can sort of double every 6 days, given the right conditions, which in the right conditions is brilliant. So it's used as a biofertilizer, a biofuel. You can use it to feed livestock. It grows, it covers water bodies very quickly, so it's great for mosquito control. If you drink coffee or eat rice, you will have this fern involved. It increases rice production by about 1/3. However, in watercourses, so for instance in the UK where we find azolla, we use this little beetle, or weevil, to control it. And this is the reason why. This is actually last summer in Spain. This is during lockdown, but spotted it in a Spanish paper, a website. And this is azolla in one of the national parks, causing a huge problem. These azolla beds can be sort of 30 centimeters deep, so really thick accumulations of fern, and these get sucked into turbines and water pipes and stuff like that, so it just causes a huge amount of problem. So it's illegal to release it into the wild in the UK. Ferns haven't always read the guidebooks, so you will often find strange combinations of ferns. So this is an acid-loving fern, Struthiops spicant, the hard fern, and lime-loving fern, Splenium mediantum nigrum, a black spleenwort, growing together in a very cold granite scree at sea level on the North Wales coast. So you can get strange combinations. That sort of brings me on to ID, a bit about identification. And really there are 3 things that we look for. So as I say, the first thing I would do when I find a fern usually is turn it over gently. And I'm looking for the reproductive structures on the back, the sori. If it is a young fern and it doesn't have them yet, for some groups that may mean I can't identify it. Okay, now because I've looked at them long enough, I could probably work out what it is. But generally, if it doesn't have those reproductive structures, some ferns, it's just a no, I can't do it. So often look around for others or revisit it later in the season when it's fertile. Habitat, so where is it growing, can be critically important. And growth form, so is it a shuttlecock? Is it creeping through the undergrowth in a line? Is it a sort of half-hearted shuttlecock? It's sort of in a shuttlecock, but then there are other bits straggling off it. A lot of them can just be identified in the field, but there are some that you do have to examine under the microscope. Now, on the whole, I would suggest you can usually do your recording with photography. But occasionally you will need to take bits. Obviously, collecting guidelines, you know, be aware you do need the landowner's permission. Only collect a small part. Usually you don't need a small pinnule or a fertile part of the frond. You don't need the whole plant. It's illegal to dig up plants. So just be very mindful. If it's the only one, don't collect it, just admire it in situ. You don't need to know its name. It's only where it's critical that you might need to take a specimen. So Polypodium you have to put under a microscope. Isoetes you have to put under a microscope, and hybrids, and some ferns will hybridize quite happily, and those need to be examined under a microscope. But most of the others can be recorded in situ. Generally, with a lens and with a camera, you can get most of what you need. So who's recording it, where did you find it, and when did you find it? If you know what it is, great. If you don't know what it is, don't worry. Plenty of people are able to help with ID, either on Twitter, or you can email pictures to Covnard or myself. And we're more than happy to help with ID, or tell you what you need to do to confirm your ID. So this is an example of a fern where you might need to sort of do some more work. And so the first thing I'd look at on the right, so bottom right, picture of the back of the frond. Usually it's more important than the front of the frond, because I can see the reproductive structures. So I can see the sori, which in this case just cover the whole of the back of the frond, the pinnules. They don't have indusium, they're just sort of covering it en masse. So that's really distinctive. A view of the fronds themselves, so where they are, the sort of growth habitat. So these are more sort of creeping, they're not shuttlecock. In a small clump, they're sort of spreading through the surrounding vegetation. And then a general habitat shot. And I can see there's bracken in the foreground, so I know that's dry, free draining. And I know there are reeds in the background, so that's a wet habitat. And it's actually growing between the two. And this is marsh fern. This is, again, quite rare now. Thalictris palustris. This is Valley on Anglesey, a good place to see it, but most other places it's disappeared as we've improved drainage in wetland habitats. In terms of an online key, as I say, I'll send you links to all of these and a book list as well. On the British Pteridological website, so ebps.org.uk, we have a key. And there are notes and you can access the key. And the nice thing about this key is we've taken out all of the really rare ferns. So the things like the woodsias and the holly ferns that you're not going to stumble across and you're not going to find in an urban setting, or the annual ferns. So we're just concentrating on the common ferns here. So there's a key that you can work through there. If you prefer your more traditional resources, they range, as with all of these things, they range from the free to the inexpensive through to the horrifically expensive, depending upon how much you want to spend. The BPS produce a free guide on their website, What's That Fern, with the common native ones that you can sort of print out yourself, and if you just want to do sort of picture matching, that's perfect. The FSC do a fold-out key, which is lovely. That has most of them, including some of the rarer ones, so that can sort of stray. That's my go-to. The next one, which is the FSC, the Fern Guide. This is James Merriweather's thin field guide, and that is perfect for, that lives in my recording bag basically, because that's got a good key to things like the horsetails, which I can never remember the details of it in the field, so having something that I can use. More recently, James Merriweather's produced a new one, Britain's Ferns, which is the Wild Guide one with the Polypodies on the cover. Really nice book. It's sort of in two halves. It's got a bit about the ferns and then the more traditional species pages with details, so that's really nice. And then you've got Chris Page's Fern Flora, which is the, if you like, the Bible that most pteridologists would refer to for critical characteristics. In terms of field equipment, really all you need is a loop for examining things like the shape of the sori or markings on scales, camera, GPS for recording locations, but otherwise it's sort of equipment wise it's quite easy. Lots of other publications. There are as many publications as there are UK ferns, depending upon what particular interest you have and what you're wanting to study, really. Robin Moran's Natural History of Ferns is brilliant. He is probably, I would suggest, one of the world's best pteridologists. He works at New York Botanic Gardens and brilliant teacher on ferns. You've got Chris Page's, what are they called? They're trying to think of the hardback series, the Nature series. Now that's the paperback version, but the hardback version will set you back £600. Liverworts, mosses and ferns of Europe, so all of the European fern flora in one publication, so sort of 190 species. But that's very much a key type book. It's not an illustrative guide. Fern ecology for more about the ways in which ferns survive. Specialist books on tree ferns, and a lovely atlas. The Ferns, Clubmoss Horsetails and Horsetails of Cornwall is a great example of an atlas, and it's got a lovely royal fern on the cover. The BPS produce special publications. So as well as our free guide, we produce atlases, sort of specific taxa guide. So Ken Trawen wrote the Dryopteris affinis complex, which I'll talk about in a second. Unfortunately, before his untimely demise, that baton has now been picked up by Alison Evans, who is just starting her PhD at Edge Hill University, researching the British Dryoptera affinis complex. So that will take up quite a few years. John Edgington's recent released Who Found Our Ferns, which is more about the history of ferns and recording things like Ray's books. I've alluded to, but I've not really mentioned Dryopteris in any great detail because it's the one thing that intrigues and stumps beginners to fern identification. These are all Dryopteris affinis, so all the same but incredibly variably different. And this isn't complete by any stage. I'm putting this together to try and get my own head around the layout of the Dryopteris affinis complex within the UK. So you've got the sort of tripinnate common buckler ferns, so things like Dryopteris amula, Dryopteris expansa, dilatata, and Carthusiana, and cristata. So these are your buckler ferns, and then the rest of this is really the male fern group. So Dryopteris felix mas, which is the common male fern. Dryopteris oreades, which is the mountain male fern, and then the affinis complex, which includes Dryopteris affinis, lots of different, I say subspecies, but depends on the author that you're looking at. So for instance, Stace has demoted these in his last publication, in Stace 4, I think it is, but most pteridologists now regard them as species within their own right, and there's been a newly described one in the last BPS publication. So a very complex, fluid group that share a lot of identification characteristics. They are prone to hybridization as well, just to add another layer. And they can undergo both sexual and asexual reproduction. So some of the spores are self-fertile, if through chromosome doubling. They can actually sow a spore that can grow straight into an adult plant without the need for fertilization. So just to help matters. In terms of the BPS, normally, as I say, in a normal year, we would be having lots of, this time of year, we'll be starting up our field trips. So typically Easter, I would be taking people to places like Anglesey. And then the fern season usually runs through to the autumn. And that will be full of both field visits for people who like to do field botany, and also we do a lot of horticultural events, so shows and exhibitions and things like the World Museum in Liverpool. But obviously that's all on hold at the moment. Hopefully we will be able to do some field trips later in the year. Fingers crossed, I'm itching to take people out again. Again, also I would normally try and do some practical fern training courses at Treborth Botanic Gardens in Bangor in the summer, and we'll have to see whether or not we can do that this year. We also have a spore exchange and a plant exchange. We do a lot of horticultural shows. We do grants for people wanting to do research or do studies, both in horticulture and in scientific contexts. We have 3 publications, Pteridologist, which is that magazine on the right, which is I suppose a light, easy read one with lots of photos and growing information and a mixture of articles. We have the Gazette, which is our peer-reviewed scientific publication. And then we have the Bulletin, which is news about all of our groups and what we've done and where we've been and what we've found and that sort of thing. Most of it's available on the BPS website. Also on there, you'll find all the old articles. So this is an example. All of the Batricums from, so the Moonworts from Greenland and Iceland. So we've done a trip, and then this is what we found. And then you've got identification features. So a lot more detailed stuff on the BPS website. Normally, as I say, we'll be aiming to be in the field a lot of the time. So this is a Moonwort survey. I don't know if you can see those little cocktail sticks. But each of those is a little moonwort like that. So what we're doing is this is a set quadrat that we go back to every year. I've got these scattered all over the place, and we map where each moonwort and adder's tongue appears, where they disappear, where they move, and that sort of thing. So we're building up a pattern. Conservation work. So this is Robbie and myself were trying to rescue some Lycopodiella in Snowdonia for translocation due to habitat destruction. So active sort of conservation projects and mapping projects for the rare ferns. And sort of with that in mind, there's one that we're really trying to find at the moment because it is disappearing, and that is pillwort. This is Pilularia globulifera. So this is a plant, this is a fern of ponds, usually things like cattle ponds, which undergo some form of seasonal drying. So the water will be high in the winter and then fall back in the summer. And this frond likes that bare ground where there's no competition and creeps along the bottom, the mud. It's quite happy underwater as well. You get these tiny little crosiers, and you get these pills, which are sporocarps at the bottom, which are a method of reproduction. Not very big ferns. I'll say there's my hand for scale. But they have this distinctive sort of stretching growth habit. As I say, typically often they'd be found in cattle ponds, but with the move to troughs, cattle troughs, then a lot of agricultural ponds have disappeared. Still does well in Anglesey, But all of the other Vice County records seem to be drying up. I'm not finding it in Snowdonia. There's one site left in Denbighshire, where I counts as Flintshire. Don't think there are any left in Denbighshire. So if you do come across Pilwort, or you know of a site, or you think you remember where you found it previously, go back and share, see if you can find it, and let us know. Be really interested to find out more.